Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her military jacket for the third time that morning, making sure every button was perfectly aligned. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Fort Bradley training grounds, where soldiers were already gathering for their daily physical training session. Maria walked with measured steps, her back straight, and her chin held high. But anyone watching closely might notice the slight hesitation in her stride. At 28 years old, Maria had served her country for nearly a decade. She had earned respect through hard work, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. Her service record was spotless, filled with commendations and achievements that most soldiers could only dream of. She had served 2 tours overseas, leading troops through dangerous missions and bringing everyone home safely. But today felt different. Today, General Robert Harrison was visiting their base for a routine inspection and training evaluation. Harrison was known throughout the military for his tough approach and zero tolerance for what he considered weakness or excuses. He had built his reputation on pushing soldiers beyond their limits, believing that only through extreme challenges could true warriors be forged. Maria joined the formation of soldiers assembled on the training field. Around her, fellow service members stretched and prepared for what they knew would be an intense morning workout. She could feel the familiar tension building in her left shoulder, the same tension that had been her constant companion for the past 18 months. "Attention!" shouted Captain Miller, the base training officer. "We have the honor of General Harrison joining us for today's physical training session." General Harrison stepped forward, his tall frame imposing in the early morning light. His gray hair was cut military short, and his steel-blue eyes surveyed the assembled soldiers with the intensity of a hawk studying its prey. He had the kind of presence that commanded immediate respect and attention from everyone around him. "I've heard that this unit prides itself on being among the best," Harrison began, his voice carrying across the field without need for amplification. "Today, we'll see if that reputation is deserved. We'll start with a 5-mile run, followed by standard calisthenics, and finish with combat drills." A murmur of anticipation rippled through the ranks. 5 miles was challenging but manageable for most of the soldiers present. Maria felt her stomach tighten as she mentally prepared for what was ahead. "Sir," Maria stepped forward, her voice clear and respectful. "Staff Sergeant Santos requesting permission to participate in modified training today." The general's eyes locked onto her immediately, his expression hardening. Around them, other soldiers shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension that suddenly filled the air. "Modified training?" Harrison's voice carried a note of disdain. "And what exactly would require such special treatment, Staff Sergeant?" Maria maintained her composure, despite feeling dozens of eyes watching her every move. "Medical profile, sir. Shoulder limitation that requires modified physical training activities." General Harrison studied her for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face down to her military jacket and back again. To him, she appeared to be in perfect physical condition, young, fit, and showing no obvious signs of injury or limitation. "I see," he said slowly, his tone suggesting he saw something entirely different than what Maria was presenting. "And how long have you been dealing with this supposed shoulder problem?" The word "supposed" hit Maria like a physical blow, but she maintained her military bearing. 18 months, sir, since my last deployment." 18 months, Harrison repeated, shaking his head slightly. "That's quite a long time to be dealing with a shoulder issue that apparently doesn't affect your ability to wear your uniform properly or maintain military posture." Some of the other soldiers looked down at their feet, uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. They knew Maria's reputation and respected her as a leader and fellow warrior, but challenging a general was not something anyone did lightly. "Staff Sergeant Santos," Harrison continued, his voice growing louder so that everyone could hear clearly. "In my 30 years of military service, I've seen every excuse in the book. I've watched soldiers try to avoid their responsibilities using everything from phantom injuries to creative interpretations of medical profiles. Maria felt heat rising in her cheeks, but forced herself to remain calm. Sir, I have proper medical documentation for my profile. Documentation? Harrison scoffed. Paper can say anything. What I see standing before me is a soldier who appears perfectly capable of performing her duties, but chooses to hide behind excuses instead of pushing through temporary discomfort. The words stung because they echoed the doubts Maria had wrestled with herself. There had been many days when she wondered if she was being weak, if she should just push through the pain and ignore the medical advice she had received. Sir, with respect, this is not a temporary discomfort, Maria replied, her voice steady, despite the emotional turmoil she felt inside. Really? Harrison stepped closer, his presence even more intimidating at close range. Then perhaps you can explain to me and to your fellow soldiers exactly what this mysterious injury is that allows you to perform every other aspect of your duties, but conveniently prevents you from participating in physical training. Maria felt trapped. The full explanation of her injury was not something she discussed openly, partly because it brought back painful memories, and partly because the visible aspects of her injury were hidden beneath her uniform. She had learned to adapt, to find ways to perform her duties despite the limitations she faced. It's a combat-related injury, sir, she said simply. Combat-related, Harrison repeated, his skepticism evident. How convenient. And yet you stand here looking perfectly healthy, wearing your uniform without any apparent difficulty, showing no visible signs of this alleged combat injury. The other soldiers watched in uncomfortable silence as their respected colleague was subjected to this public interrogation. Many of them had served alongside Maria and knew her character, but military hierarchy meant that questioning a general's judgment was not an option. Staff Sergeant Santos, Harrison announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, I'm going to give you a choice. You can either participate in the full training session like every other soldier here, or you can explain to everyone exactly what this mysterious injury is that requires special treatment. Maria felt the weight of dozens of stares. She could see the mixture of curiosity, sympathy, and discomfort in the faces of her fellow soldiers. Some looked away entirely, unable to watch what felt like a public humiliation of someone they respected. The general crossed his arms and waited, clearly expecting Maria to either back down from her medical profile request or provide details that he could further challenge. His expression suggested he believed he was calling a bluff, that faced with public scrutiny, she would admit that her injury was either minor or non-existent. Maria stood silent for several long seconds, weighing her options. She could feel the familiar ache in her shoulder intensifying, partly from stress and partly from the morning's activities. The injury that had changed her life was hidden beneath layers of fabric and military bearing, invisible to those who hadn't been there when it happened. The morning breeze picked up, causing the flag on the nearby pole to snap smartly in the wind. The sound reminded Maria of other mornings in far more dangerous places when the stakes were life and death rather than professional reputation. Well, Staff Sergeant, Harrison pressed, what's it going to be? Maria's mind raced as she stood before General Harrison and the assembled soldiers. The weight of their stares felt heavier than any combat gear she had ever carried. She thought back to 18 months ago, to a dusty road outside Kandahar, where everything had changed in an instant. I'm waiting, Staff Sergeant, Harrison said impatiently, tapping his foot against the ground. Either join the full training or provide a satisfactory explanation for why you deserve special treatment. Maria took a deep breath. Sir, I prefer to participate in modified training as outlined in my medical profile. Harrison's expression darkened further. I see. So you're choosing to maintain this charade rather than be honest with your fellow soldiers. He turned to address the entire formation. This is exactly what's wrong with today's military. Too many soldiers looking for the easy way out instead of embracing the warrior spirit that built our armed forces. The general began pacing back and forth in front of the formation, using Maria as an example for his impromptu lecture. Look at Staff Sergeant Santos here. On paper, I'm sure her record looks impressive. Probably has some ribbons and commendations that look good in a display case. But when it comes time to actually demonstrate physical readiness, suddenly there's a mysterious injury that requires special accommodations. Maria felt each word like a slap across the face. Her service record wasn't just impressive on paper. It represented years of sacrifice, dedication, and genuine heroism. She had earned every commendation through actions that had saved lives and completed missions that others thought impossible. Private Johnson, a young soldier who had joined the unit just 6 months earlier, looked confused and uncomfortable. He had heard stories about Staff Sergeant Santos from other soldiers, stories about her leadership during combat operations, her ability to keep troops calm under fire, and her reputation for never leaving anyone behind. The woman being described by the general didn't match the stories he had heard. "General Harrison?" "Sir." Captain Miller stepped forward hesitantly. "Staff Sergeant Santos has an exemplary record and valid medical documentation for her profile." Harrison whirled around to face the captain. "Captain Miller, are you suggesting that I don't know how to evaluate a soldier's fitness for duty? Are you implying that I should simply accept every piece of paper that crosses my desk without using my own judgment?" Miller immediately backed down, recognizing that he had overstepped his bounds. "No, sir. My apologies, sir." "That's what I thought," Harrison said with satisfaction. He turned his attention back to Maria. "Staff Sergeant Santos, I'm going to make this very simple. I believe you're perfectly capable of completing this training. I believe your so-called injury is either completely fabricated or so minor that you're using it as an excuse to avoid challenging yourself." Maria's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she maintained her military composure. Inside, she was fighting a battle between her training to respect military authority and her need to defend her integrity. Harrison noticed her clenched fists and smiled coldly. "Oh, now we're seeing some real emotion. Interesting how quickly that happens when someone challenges these supposed medical limitations." What the general didn't understand was that Maria's anger wasn't about being challenged to exercise. Her anger came from being accused of dishonesty and cowardice when she had spent years proving exactly the opposite. She had volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, had put herself in harm's way countless times to protect others, and had never once used an excuse to avoid her responsibilities. "Sir," Maria said quietly, "I have never used my medical profile to avoid responsibilities. I participate in all other aspects of training and duty. I simply follow the medical restrictions placed on specific activities." "Restrictions," Harrison repeated mockingly. "Let me guess. You can do everything except the things that might be difficult or uncomfortable. How convenient that your injury only affects you during physical training." The accusation was so far from the truth that Maria almost laughed bitterly. Her injury affected her every single day, in ways that Harrison couldn't see and wouldn't understand. It affected her sleep, her ability to lift objects, her range of motion, and caused constant discomfort that she had learned to hide behind military bearing and professionalism. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, who had served with Maria during her last deployment, shifted uncomfortably in formation. He knew the truth about what had happened in Afghanistan. He had been there when the IED exploded, had helped carry Maria to the medical evacuation helicopter, and had seen the extent of her injuries firsthand. But military protocol prevented him from speaking out of turn, especially to contradict a general. "You know what, Staff Sergeant Santos," Harrison continued, his voice growing louder and more aggressive, "I think you've forgotten what it means to be a soldier. I think you've gotten comfortable hiding behind paperwork and medical excuses instead of pushing yourself to excel." Maria's jaw tightened. Every word the general spoke was like salt in a wound that had never fully healed. Not just the physical wound, but the emotional struggle of adapting to limitations that she had never wanted to accept. "I believe," Harrison went on, "that what you need is a reminder of what real military standards look like, what real commitment looks like, what happens when soldiers stop making excuses and start performing their duties." He stepped even closer to Maria, close enough that she could see the cold determination in his eyes. "So here's what we're going to do. You're going to participate in full training today. No modifications, no special accommodations, no hiding behind medical profiles. You're going to prove that you deserve to wear that uniform." The other soldiers watched in stunned silence. What they were witnessing went beyond normal military discipline or training standards. It had become personal for the general, though none of them understood why. Maria looked directly into Harrison's eyes. "Sir, I cannot participate in activities that exceed my medical limitations without risking further injury." "Cannot or will not," Harrison challenged, "because from where I stand, it looks like you're simply unwilling to push yourself beyond your comfort zone." The irony of his words was almost unbearable for Maria. Her comfort zone had been shattered 18 months ago on a road in Afghanistan. Everything she had done since then had been about pushing beyond limitations, adapting to new realities, and finding ways to continue serving, despite challenges that would have ended many military careers. "Staff Sergeant Santos," Harrison announced to the entire formation, "since you insist on maintaining this fiction about your limitations, I'm going to give you one final opportunity. Either remove whatever is preventing you from participating in full training, or admit that you're using excuses to avoid doing your job." Maria felt the moment crystallizing around her. She could feel the eyes of every soldier in the formation, could sense their discomfort with the situation, and could practically hear the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Some were probably wondering if the general was right, if she had been taking advantage of a system designed to help legitimately injured soldiers. The morning sun had risen higher, casting shorter shadows across the training ground. Birds chirped in nearby trees. Oblivious to the human drama unfolding below them, the normalcy of the setting contrasted sharply with the intensity of the confrontation. "Well," Harrison demanded, "what's it going to be? Are you going to continue hiding behind excuses, or are you going to show these soldiers what a real warrior looks like?" Maria's hand moved slowly toward the top button of her military jacket. The movement was almost unconscious, a response to months of frustration, years of adapting to her limitations, and a lifetime of refusing to back down from challenges to her integrity. Harrison noticed the movement and smiled triumphantly. "Finally, I knew that underneath all those excuses was a soldier who just needed the right motivation." But as Maria's fingers touched the button, she hesitated. What she was about to reveal would change everything. It would end the general's accusations, but it would also expose something she had worked hard to keep private. The choice between her privacy and her reputation hung in the balance. Maria's fingers remained on the button of her military jacket for several long seconds. The training ground had fallen completely silent except for the distant sound of wind through the trees and the flag snapping overhead. Even General Harrison seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen. "Sir," Maria said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotional storm raging inside her, "you want to know what prevents me from participating in full physical training?" Harrison nodded, his expression still confident and somewhat smug. "That's exactly what I want to know, Staff Sergeant. Let's put an end to this mystery once and for all." Maria looked around at the faces of her fellow soldiers. She saw Sergeant Rodriguez, whose eyes held a mixture of concern and understanding. She saw Private Johnson's confused expression, and Captain Miller's obvious discomfort with the entire situation. These were her brothers and sisters in arms, people she had served with and would trust with her life. "Very well, sir," Maria said, beginning to unbutton her jacket. "But I want you to understand that I have never asked for special treatment. I have only followed the medical restrictions put in place to prevent further damage to an injury sustained while serving my country." As she spoke, Maria methodically unbuttoned her military jacket from top to bottom. The other soldiers watched in complete silence. None of them sure what to expect, but all sensing that they were about to witness something important. Harrison watched impatiently, clearly expecting to see nothing more than what he considered a perfectly healthy soldier trying to make a dramatic point. "Get on with it, Staff Sergeant. We don't have all day for theatrical displays." Maria removed her jacket completely, revealing the military t-shirt underneath. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. But then she turned slightly to her left, and the soldiers nearest to her could see what the jacket had been hiding. Her left arm hung differently than her right. The shoulder sat lower, and the way she held her arm suggested limited mobility. But it wasn't until she pulled up the left sleeve of her t-shirt that the full extent of her injury became visible. A collective gasp went up from several soldiers in the formation. Maria's left shoulder and upper arm were covered in scars, not small, neat surgical scars, but the jagged, twisted scars that spoke of trauma and extensive reconstruction. The skin was discolored in places, and the muscle definition was noticeably different from her right arm. General Harrison's confident expression faltered as he took in what he was seeing. The scars were extensive, covering most of her shoulder and extending down her arm. Some were clearly from the original injury, while others showed evidence of multiple surgical procedures. "This," Maria said, her voice remaining calm and professional, "is what's left of my shoulder after an IED explosion in Afghanistan 18 months ago. The blast threw me 30 feet and embedded shrapnel in my shoulder, arm, and back. I spent 4 months in military hospitals undergoing 7 different surgeries to save my arm." The silence on the training ground was now complete. Even Harrison seemed stunned into speechlessness as Maria continued. "The doctors told me I would never regain full use of my left arm. They said I was lucky to keep it at all. My range of motion is limited to about 60% of normal. I have constant pain that I manage without medication because I choose to continue serving rather than take a medical discharge." She rolled her shoulder slightly, and even from a distance, the other soldiers could see how the movement was restricted and unnatural. "I can't raise my arm above shoulder height. I can't do pull-ups or push-ups in the traditional manner. Overhead movements cause severe pain and risk further damage to the reconstructed joint." Maria looked directly at General Harrison as she continued. "But I can still lead soldiers. I can still make tactical decisions under pressure. I can still contribute to the mission in dozens of ways that don't require me to pretend that my body works exactly the same way it did before I was injured serving my country." Harrison's face had gone pale. The confident, aggressive demeanor he had displayed just minutes earlier had completely evaporated as the reality of the situation sank in. He was looking at a soldier who had been catastrophically injured in combat and had fought her way back to continue serving, only to be accused of malingering and cowardice. Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward slightly, unable to remain silent any longer. "Sir, if I may. Staff Sergeant Santos was injured while leading a convoy escort mission. She was in the lead vehicle when the IED detonated. Her first concern after the blast was for her soldiers' safety, even while she was severely injured." Private Johnson's eyes were wide as he looked at Maria with new understanding. The stories he had heard about her weren't exaggerations. They were probably understated accounts of genuine heroism from someone who continued to serve despite carrying the permanent consequences of that service. Maria began putting her jacket back on, her movements careful and deliberate due to her limitations. "Sir, I have never used my medical profile to avoid responsibility. I have only used it to ensure that I can continue serving for as long as possible without causing permanent damage that would end my career entirely. General Harrison watched her struggle slightly with getting her left arm back into the jacket sleeve. Captain Miller stepped forward to assist her, but Maria shook her head politely, determined to manage on her own as she had learned to do with so many tasks. I participate in every aspect of training that my medical profile allows, Maria continued as she worked to button her jacket. I modify the exercises that could cause further damage, but I maintain my fitness through alternative methods approved by military physicians and physical therapists. Harrison finally found his voice, though it was much quieter and less confident than it had been earlier. Staff Sergeant Santos, I had no way of knowing. No, sir, you didn't, Maria agreed, finishing with her jacket and returning to proper military posture. Because I don't advertise my limitations or use them as excuses. I simply work within them to continue serving effectively. The general looked around at the other soldiers, many of whom were looking at him with expressions that ranged from disappointment to barely concealed anger. He had publicly humiliated and accused a combat-injured veteran of cowardice and dishonesty in front of her peers. Staff Sergeant Santos, Harrison said slowly, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions based on incomplete information, and I was wrong. Maria nodded once, accepting the apology with the same professional grace she had maintained throughout the entire confrontation. Thank you, sir. But Harrison wasn't finished. He turned to address the entire formation, his voice carrying a different tone than it had before. Let this be a lesson to all of us about the danger of making judgments without complete information. Staff Sergeant Santos embodies the warrior spirit I was talking about earlier, not by avoiding challenges, but by adapting to them and continuing to serve despite significant obstacles. He paused, looking directly at Maria again. Your dedication to service, despite your limitations, is an example to every soldier here. I was wrong to challenge your medical profile, and I was wrong to suggest that you were avoiding your responsibilities. Maria remained at attention, but several of the other soldiers could see the relief in her posture. For months, she had endured subtle questions and occasional comments about her modified training, always wondering if others thought she was taking advantage of the system. Staff Sergeant Santos, Harrison said, please proceed with your modified training as outlined in your medical profile, and anyone who has questions about the validity of combat-related medical limitations can discuss those questions with me directly. As the formation was dismissed and soldiers began moving toward their various training activities, many of them approached Maria with words of support and respect. Private Johnson, in particular, seemed eager to apologize for any doubts he might have harbored. Staff Sergeant, he said quietly, I'm sorry for not understanding. Thank you for continuing to serve despite everything. Maria smiled at the young soldier. Private Johnson, you don't owe me any apologies. You couldn't have known what you couldn't see. The important thing is that we all learned something today about not making assumptions about each other. General Harrison approached her as the crowd dispersed. Staff Sergeant Santos, I want you to know that your example today will stay with me. I've been in the military for 30 years, and I thought I had seen every kind of soldier. But I've never met anyone who demonstrated more courage and professionalism than you did today. Maria nodded respectfully. Thank you, sir. We all serve in different ways. As the morning training session continued, Maria participated in her modified routine, exercises designed to maintain her fitness while respecting the limitations imposed by her injury. But now, instead of curious stares or whispered questions, she received nods of respect and understanding from her fellow soldiers. General Harrison watched from a distance as Maria led a group of newer soldiers through tactical drills that didn't require the physical abilities she had lost. Her leadership skills were evident as she guided them through complex scenarios, sharing knowledge gained through years of experience and sacrifice. Later that day, Harrison made a point of updating Maria's personnel file with a commendation recognizing her continued service despite combat-related disabilities. He also implemented new protocols for his future inspections, ensuring that medical profiles would be reviewed and understood before any questions were raised about their legitimacy. The story of what happened that morning spread throughout the base and beyond, becoming a powerful reminder that heroism comes in many forms, and that the greatest strength is often found in those who continue to serve others despite facing their own significant challenges. Maria Santos had proven that a true warrior isn't defined by physical perfection, but by the willingness to adapt, overcome, and continue serving others regardless of personal cost.